I really like the texture and flow that I get when I work with wet in wet watercolor. That just basically means that I'm putting wet paint on wet paper. If I were putting my wet paint on dry paper, it would be wet on dry watercolor. So keep in mind that when you work with wet in wet, wherever you put your water down, your pigment will flow all through that area. And the more puddly your water is, the more your pigment will travel. So if your paper is very wet, you'll get a lot of pigment swirls and flow. And if your paper is just a little bit wet, you'll get a slight bleed throughout. Here I'm mixing up a bit of yellow ochre with a brown to get a sort of darker wheat color that I'm putting in my mouse. I wet only my mouse area because that's the only area that I want this brown to go into. When you're working in watercolor, you want to start with your lightest colors first and then build up in layers, darker and darker colors. So right now I'm painting just a basic undertone and I'm paying attention to the variation of color that my mouse has. So the little bit of pink in the nose and muzzle area, reflection of the green from the grass on the belly there, and the pink on the various little paws that he has. So I'm okay with a little bit of mingling because it'll create some kind of natural transitions. If I find that my pink or my green are traveling too far, I'll take a little paper towel and I'll dab up that area with just the corner of my paper towel. Notice how as I lay down my pigment, my paint starts to travel a little bit because those areas next to it are still wet. Again, it's okay with me to have a little bit of traveling for my underpainting. I'll be more careful about this later on when I start to get into details. Now that I have some basic color on my mouse, I'm going to move to other parts of my painting to give my mouse a chance to dry before I add my next layers. It's important to make sure that your paint is dry before you add your next layers, otherwise you'll end up with some kind of fuzzy edges and blending in areas that you really don't want. I want to keep my dandelion fluff very light and almost glowy looking, so I'm gonna dab an edge of water around it and then put a light bit of green pigment into it. This will help keep my transition soft and light instead of having a harsh edge on my green. Next, I'm going to use water to outline my shapes and fill in my background so that I can start to dab different greens into it and they'll mix and mingle and create some nice soft textures. As I continue to add water and pull the green pigment up, I'm going to outline very carefully around my mouse because I don't really want that green to get inside the brown. If you need to take the green right up to the edge of the mouse, make sure that your mouse is thoroughly dry before you do that. Otherwise, you will end up with green seeping into your mouse. You can always use a hairdryer to shorten your drying time. I want to add a little more depth and weight to the bottom of my picture, so I'm adding a different green. While the paper is still wet, this will allow it to blend nicely, but it will still have its own essence. Anytime I feel like an edge is going to be too harsh or not blend well enough, I can just take a wet paintbrush without any paint on it and just blend it a little bit. Here, I felt like I added a little too much green to the tip of the dandelion, so I dabbed my paintbrush off onto my paper towel to dry it and lifted the excess paint off. As my mouse has started to dry, I've noticed some blooming happening in the body, so I'm going to take a damp paintbrush with just water and lift a little bit of that pigment off to smooth it out. Now that I've worked around the background and even gotten up and walked away from my painting for a little bit, my mouse has had enough time to dry that I can add a second layer. I noticed the edges of my mouse have dried a little more harshly than I would like, so I take a damp paintbrush and just gently lift some of those edges to clean them up and soften them out. It may look, because of the speed of the video, that I'm scrubbing kind of harshly on my paper, but I'm really not. I'm always careful to allow my brush to flow naturally with the bristles. If I scrub, I'm going to damage the bristles of my brush, and I'm also going to cause the fibers of my paper to come up and create pulp in my painting. So just be careful and make sure that you're using your brush gently. Watercolor tends to dry a little bit lighter than it appears when it's wet. So my underpainting is quite light, and I've decided to go ahead and add another layer of color that will increase the richness of it. Here again, I use a paintbrush with just water to pull some of that strong pigment up and blend a little bit. Here I'm using green with a cool dark brown, just a little bit of the cool dark brown, to create sort of a gray-green shadowy color. So I thought I had my camera running when I added all of the little details to the mouse. Unfortunately, I did not. So here's a quick view of what I did to add the fur texture. Using a finely pointed detail brush, I added several short strokes in different angles and at different widths. Then I used a little bit of water on one end to kind of blend one side of them into the mouse. Here again, my green ends up being a little bit too dark, so I come in with a wet paintbrush with just water to lighten it up. With watercolor, we depend on the paper and dilution with water in order to get lighter effects. Even if you have white on your palette, you should not use it to lighten your colors. You'll end up making them dull and chalky looking. The white in your palette is called gouache, and it's good for adding like details at the very end here and there, like I am with the whiskers and the shine in the eyes, but it should never be used to lighten your colors. When using the white gouache, you want to add enough water to it that you have the consistency of about melted ice cream. That will allow you to put strokes over your painting and have them show up a little bit better. For the best results with your gouache, make sure that your painting is thoroughly dry before you start to add this final layer. If your paper is damp at all, it will start to cause your gouache to spread and be a lot more dull. While the gouache shows up nice and bright in the very dark eye, the background's a little too light for it to show up as strongly as I want, so I go ahead and add some dark green just around the tip of the nose and then blend it with some water so that I can make those whiskers stand out just a little bit more. I hope you had fun watching and were inspired to create your own watercolor sketch.